When Ben Shapiro asked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez 3 direct math questions on live television, the woman with 8.6 million followers, the undeniable face of the Green New Deal, and the voice of a generation could not answer a single one. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the broadcast. As a fellow politician who has stood behind those podiums and a broadcaster who sits behind this desk, I have seen every rhetorical trick in the book. But what we witnessed last night was a profound collision between political poetry and cold, hard arithmetic. While the internet exploded over this debate, the most important viewer was not a pundit or a rival politician. It was a 7th grade math teacher in the Bronx, watching from her living room with a pencil in hand, who proved that while politicians can spin words, they cannot spin numbers. Let us set the scene for what happened last night. This debate stage was not a grand congressional hearing room lined with marble and flags, nor did it feature a gallery of spectators arranged in ascending rows like a jury. Instead, it was an intimate, unforgiving space featuring just 2 podiums and a moderator's desk situated squarely between them. The environment was captured by 4 cameras positioned so closely that they could catch a single blink. As anyone who has worked in television knows, the lighting was flat and bright, classic studio lighting designed to completely remove shadows and force everything into the exact same plane of visibility. This is incredibly useful when the primary thing you want the audience to see is a face that has simply run out of answers. Far away from the studio lights, in a modest living room in the Bronx, a 61-year-old woman named Dorothy Chen turned on her television set. She placed a cup of tea on her side table, laid out a sheet of ruled paper on the arm of her chair, and picked up a sharpened pencil. Dorothy is the kind of citizen every politician should be terrified of, because for 34 years, she has been teaching 7th grade mathematics at a public school located squarely within AOC's own district. Over those 3.5 decades, Dorothy developed a habit that her husband playfully called obsessive, but which she rightfully called professional. Whenever someone on television stated a number, she wrote it down. She did not do this for political reasons, but for accuracy, knowing full well that numbers, unlike the people who deploy them, do not possess opinions. Just yesterday in her classroom during a lesson on fractions, a student named Marcus had raised his hand and asked her a simple, innocent question. "Miss Chen, how much does the Green New Deal cost?" Dorothy had not had an answer for her student then, but tonight she fully intended to find one. She told her husband, who was quietly reading a paperback in the next room, that she was just going to write down the numbers when they said them. Drawing a neat line down the center of her ruled page, she wrote Shapiro on the left side and AOC on the right, and then she waited. The dynamic on the screen was a fascinating study in contrasts. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood at her podium displaying the pristine posture of a woman who had learned exactly how to occupy a frame across 1,000 Instagram live streams and 100 cable news appearances. Her shoulders were pulled back, her chin was angled perfectly toward the camera lens, and her hands moved in measured gestures that were neither too large nor too small, but exactly the right size to register as authentic passion on a 6.5-inch screen. She began by asking the audience if we want an economy that works for everyone, or one that only works for the people in the room. She deployed a practiced pause, not mechanical, but deeply trained, much like a singer's vibrato is shaped from a natural instinct into a highly reliable instrument. She boldly declared that the Green New Deal is not a mere policy paper, but rather a moral document, asserting that the richest country on earth should guarantee its citizens clean air, clean water, good jobs, and a livable planet. She proclaimed that if keeping that promise is radical, then she is proud to be radical, which was met immediately with warm, quick applause from an audience that had clearly been prepared to applaud. At the opposite podium stood Ben Shapiro, wearing a suit that appeared slightly too large for him and a yarmulke held securely in place by a bobby pin. His hands rested casually at his sides, and his expression carried the distinct patience of a man who has been quietly waiting for his opponent to finish a sentence that he fully intends to disassemble. When he spoke, he acknowledged her passion, but immediately pivoted to his core objective, speaking with a fast voice, not rushed, but possessing the natural velocity of a man whose brain operates at a speed that his mouth has spent 39 years attempting to match. He agreed that the debate was fundamentally about math and numbers, but he set the ground rules early by admitting he was not a senator, did not have a folder full of subpoenas, and lacked a sprawling committee behind him. Gesturing to the empty stage, he stated he was just a guy with a microphone who had questions, and he wanted the Congresswoman to answer them with numbers, not with speeches or moral documents. He leaned in and asked the defining question of the night. "Congresswoman, what does the Green New Deal cost?" AOC immediately deflected, stating that the Green New Deal is a non-binding resolution. Shapiro, unyielding, acknowledged what it was, but pressed again on what it costs to implement. AOC argued that the cost depends entirely on the scope of implementation, which would have to be determined later. Shapiro's voice did not rise in volume. Instead, it simply accelerated as he pleaded for any number at all, a ballpark, a range, something concrete. In the Bronx, Dorothy Chen's pencil hovered expectantly over the right column labeled AOC, waiting for a figure to emerge, but the number never came. With the meticulous handwriting of a woman who has graded papers for 34 years and refuses to waste ink, Dorothy placed a small, neat question mark on the page. It would be her first question mark of the night. AOC then mentioned that the American Action Forum had estimated a cost of $93 trillion, but she quickly dismissed that figure as deliberately inflated by a conservative think tank. Shapiro leaned an inch closer to his microphone and pointed out the glaring contradiction. She had introduced this resolution, acted as its primary sponsor, and built her entire career upon it, yet she did not possess her own cost estimate from her office, a friendly think tank, or anyone else. AOC's voice found its sharp, certain edge, the kind of tone perfect for a soundbite that would trend on social media for days, as she retorted that you do not price a framework, you only price the legislation that actually implements it. Shapiro immediately asked if she had a number for any of that implementing legislation, and what followed was silence. It was a short silence, perhaps just half a second, but Shapiro caught it instantly on instinct, much like a shortstop snagging a line drive before the brain even has time to process the movement. He declared that her silence was the answer. He pointed out that she was asking 330 million Americans to fundamentally alter how they live, drive, heat their homes, eat, and work without producing a single cost estimate. He accused her of outsourcing the basic mathematics to people she dismisses as bad faith actors while utterly failing to do her own homework. Then, Shapiro decided to do the math for her. He asked 3 rapid-fire yes or no questions. 1. Should every American have access to health care? AOC answered yes. 2. Should every American have a guaranteed job? Yes. 3. Should America achieve net zero emissions by 2050? Yes. With the calm demeanor of a man simply reading a grocery receipt, Shapiro laid out the figures. Universal health care costs approximately $3 trillion a year. A federal jobs guarantee costs between $500 billion and $2 trillion, depending on the model. And the lowest serious estimate for net zero emissions sits between $5 trillion and $10 trillion over 25 years. He informed her that she had just agreed to between $15 trillion and $93 trillion in new spending, effectively pricing her framework in 30 seconds using her own answers. Back in the Bronx, Dorothy was diligently writing this down. 3T plus 2T plus 5T equals 10T minimum, heavily underlining the word minimum. She glanced at AOC's column, which remained stubbornly blank, except for the solitary question mark. Turning to a fresh page, Dorothy wrote a single pressing question. Where is her number? Feeling the pressure, AOC's voice climbed in altitude, desperately reaching for the moral high ground to escape the gravity of the arithmetic. She accused Shapiro of wanting to reduce human survival to a line item, asking how one could possibly put a price tag on Miami going underwater, California burning, or children breathing clean air. She insisted this was not a spreadsheet, but a profound moral question, claiming his focus on numbers revealed a deeply flawed worldview. The studio audience responded not with outright applause, but with a low murmur of agreement that swept through the seats like a light breeze, touching everything lightly, but committing to absolutely nothing. Shapiro waited patiently for the murmur to fade before delivering the most unhurried and devastating point of his evening. He agreed that it was indeed a moral question, but argued that the most moral thing a government can possibly do before demanding its citizens pay for a program is to look them in the eye and tell them exactly what it costs. He noted that she was asking a waitress in Queens earning $35,000 a year and a math teacher in the Bronx earning $58,000 a year to blindly fund a policy whose basic math she had refused to calculate. He declared that politicians do not get to skip the math just because their cause feels important, because the people footing the bill are not billionaires. They are teachers, waitresses, and bus drivers who fundamentally deserve to know the price of what they are being asked to buy. In that moment, hearing the words math teacher in the Bronx, Dorothy Chen's pencil came to a complete halt. Shapiro did not know her name or even that she existed, but he was speaking directly to her reality. Looking down at her paper with Shapiro's column overflowing with figures and AOC's column painfully blank, Dorothy realized a truth she had known for 34 years in the classroom, but had never applied to national politics. The person holding the numbers is not always right, but the person without them is always unprepared. To a teacher, being unprepared is infinitely worse than being wrong, because it proves you didn't do the work, and not doing the homework is the one sin Dorothy Chen simply does not forgive. Meanwhile, backstage in a cramped room littered with vibrating phones and stacked briefing papers, the reality of the disaster was setting in. AOC's communications advisor sat with her arms tightly crossed, having spent the last 6 minutes desperately texting a team that couldn't respond because their boss was trapped on live television. The advisor's final text read, "She needs to stop answering yes, no. He's building a cage." Watching AOC attempt to navigate the next question, the advisor pressed both palms flat against the folding table and whispered to an empty room, "Pivot to stories. Stop engaging on numbers." But it was far too late. Shapiro shifted to the proposed federal jobs guarantee, establishing that every American who wants a job would get one. He then asked a devastatingly logical question: what happens if someone with a guaranteed job performs bad work? AOC vaguely suggested there would be performance standards and mechanisms within the program. Shapiro cornered her, demanding a yes or no answer on whether a person in a government-guaranteed job could actually be fired for bad performance. AOC gripped her podium tightly, her knuckles whitening under the immense intellectual pressure of trying to force a sentence in two completely opposing directions simultaneously. She offered that in extreme cases there would be a process. Shapiro, speaking with the clean, fast precision of a surgical scalpel, pointed out the inescapable trap. If they can be fired, the job is not guaranteed. But if they cannot be fired, she is creating an economy where performance simply does not matter. When AOC accused him of creating a false binary, Shapiro rightly noted that he was merely describing the binary that exists in reality, because a guarantee implies you cannot lose it, while a job inherently requires performance. It was not a political opinion, it was pure logic, and he swiftly moved on, leaving the point entirely settled. He then confronted her on her identity as a democratic socialist, asking her to name a single socialist country that had successfully implemented her proposed policies. When she predictably cited the Scandinavian nations of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, Shapiro countered with a direct quote from Denmark's own prime minister, who publicly pleaded for people to stop calling Denmark socialist, firmly stating that Denmark is a market economy, not a socialist planned economy. He added that Sweden has no minimum wage, possesses no inheritance tax, and utilizes a universal school voucher program that would make Milton Friedman weep with joy. Deploying a rare, perfectly timed pause, Shapiro highlighted the absurdity of using countries that actively reject the socialist label to justify a deeply socialist platform, comparing it to citing a vegetarian to sell hamburgers. In her living room, Dorothy jotted down, "Denmark equals not socialist," PM said, and added a second question mark to AOC's column. There were now multiple blanks where concrete facts should have been provided by the woman representing the very district where Dorothy had taught children how to solve for X since before the Congresswoman was even born. The climax of the debate centered on taxes and revenue. Shapiro asked AOC 3 sequential questions, asking her to answer each before he responded. First, does she believe the wealthy should pay their fair share? She said absolutely. Second, what tax rate on income above $10 million would she consider fair? She confidently stated 70%, noting she had been public about this. Third, if the government taxed all income above $10 million at 100% confiscating every single dollar, how much revenue would that actually generate per year? AOC's mouth opened and closed in a quarter of a second, the exact duration it takes for a brain to frantically search a mental shelf only to find it completely empty, and she mumbled that it depends. Shapiro stepped in to help her, citing IRS data showing approximately $650 billion in total income, above $10 million per year. He explained that if the government confiscated 100% of it, taking every single penny and leaving the wealthy with absolutely nothing, it would generate exactly $650 billion. Holding up one finger, he reminded her that by her own party's estimates, the Green New Deal cost between $500 billion and $1 trillion per year. Holding up a second finger, he calculated her proposed 70% tax rate on that $650 billion, which equals exactly $455 billion. He let that concrete number hang in the air, pointing out that $455 billion doesn't even cover the lowest possible estimate for her program. Even under a scenario of total confiscation, the math simply fails. Placing both hands firmly on his podium, he asked her a genuine, non-rhetorical question. Who pays the rest? Dorothy Chen's pencil was moving furiously. She calculated $650 billion times 70% equals $455 billion. With the program requiring $500 billion to $1 trillion per year, she determined there was a minimum deficit of $45 billion. She stopped writing and stared thoughtfully at the ceiling, thinking deeply about something far larger than the television screen. She wasn't thinking about the Green New Deal anymore. She was thinking about her student Marcus. She was thinking about the 28 kids in her classroom, the 400 kids in her school, and the millions of children across the country who would eventually grow up, enter the workforce, open their paychecks, and discover that a chunk of their hard-earned money was being taken to fund a massive program that its very creator couldn't even put a price tag on. Disheartened, Dorothy put her pencil down, feeling that the paper had said more than enough. Back on stage, AOC scrambled to build a defensive wall in real time, claiming that economic growth would magically generate the additional revenue required. Shapiro repeated the word growth with the weary tone of a math teacher evaluating an answer that is technically possible but practically useless. He summarized her position. Her plan to fund a program that costs more than taxing every rich person in America at 100% relies entirely on growing her way out of a massive deficit that exists even in the absolute best-case scenario. After a second rare pause, he told her plainly that relying on such growth is not economics, it is faith. His voice softened, stripping away the debate performance to reveal genuine honesty, as he explained that as an observant Jew, he believes deeply in faith, but faith firmly belongs in a synagogue, not in a federal budget. Shapiro closed his argument by summarizing the utter lack of substance he had encountered. He reiterated that he didn't have a briefcase or a committee, just questions, and she had failed to answer 3 critical ones. He held up his fingers one by one to count the blanks. What does the Green New Deal cost? Blank. Who pays when taxing the rich at 100% isn't nearly enough? A second blank. How does a jobs guarantee work if people can actually be fired? A third blank. He reminded her that these three gaping blanks existed at the core of a policy she had built her entire career on. He hadn't fabricated these blanks. She had produced them herself simply by not having the numbers. He declared that any seventh grade math teacher would give that paper an F, and they would be entirely right because the blanks weren't an accident. The blanks were the actual policy. He accused her of knowing the math doesn't work, which is exactly why she chose the easier path of branding it a moral document and shaming anyone who dared ask for numbers by accusing them of wanting the planet to burn. Shapiro forcefully concluded that asking for numbers is what responsible adults do before they spend other people's money, and it is exactly what a math teacher in the Bronx does every single day before issuing a grade. He challenged the Congresswoman, stating that if seventh graders can do their homework, so can she. When the moderator offered AOC a chance to respond, she stood before 4.2 million viewers, trying desperately to find a single sentence that would make the undeniable blanks disappear. But that sentence simply did not exist. Every potential factual response required a number, and she had learned over the grueling 90-minute debate that offering a number to a man whose brain functions like a calculator with a law degree was essentially handing ammunition to someone who had already built the gun. Consequently, she chose to offer no numbers at all, and that ongoing refusal was a devastating answer in itself. Her voice, which had started the night sharp and certain while discussing the planet's future, had now been reduced to something much smaller and thinner. She offered a hollow 7-word response, "In the future, we're building." There were no numbers, no math, and no actual answers, just a political slogan standing awkwardly where a serious policy blueprint was urgently required. The aftermath was swift and merciless. A 60-second clip of Shapiro asking for the cost, followed by AOC's silence, and his declaration that her silence was her answer, hit 30 million views before midnight, circulating across every platform and in every language where basic arithmetic holds true. Backstage, AOC's advisor could only stare at her laptop before telling a producer that the Congresswoman needed to stop answering yes or no, though the damage was already permanently done. Within hours, 2 progressive organizations rushed to issue statements defending the Green New Deal, but noticeably, neither statement included a single cost estimate. As a reporter for The Washington Post pointed out in the 4th paragraph of her article, this glaring omission was infinitely more damaging than anything Shapiro had actually said on stage, because it completely validated his central thesis without him even being in the room. As the night ended, Dorothy Chen turned off her television in the Bronx and looked down at her 2 columns. Shapiro's side was filled with precise figures. $93 trillion, $3 trillion, $2 trillion, $5 trillion, $650 billion, $455 billion, 70%, 100%. AOC's side contained nothing but the words growth and moral document. She folded the paper, slipped it into her bag, and prepared for the next day. She knew that when she walked into room 214 and her student Marcus inevitably raised his hand to ask how much the policy cost, she would unfold that paper, place it on his desk, and show him the stark reality. One side brought numbers, while the other side brought only blanks. In math class, blanks earn a 0. More importantly, she planned to ask Marcus what he thought that meant, equipping him not just with an answer, but with the oldest and most powerful tools in mathematics, a pencil, a piece of paper, and the critical understanding that if a politician cannot show you the math probably doesn't work. Miles away in her Washington apartment, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat at her kitchen table, looking at a frozen frame of the debate on her laptop. In front of her rested a napkin bearing the number $455 billion written in her own handwriting. After the debate, sitting privately in her car, she had finally done the math on the back of a receipt, checking her answers like a student, hoping they got the test right, but she hadn't. She realized that $455 billion was less than $500 billion, confirming that the math simply didn't work at a 70% tax rate, didn't work at 80%, and barely even worked at a 100% total confiscation rate. Even then, it only covered a low estimate that absolutely nobody seriously believed. The numbers on her napkin perfectly matched the numbers Dorothy Chen had calculated in the Bronx. Though neither woman knew the other existed, the uncompromising nature of real mathematics had brought them to the exact same undeniable conclusion. The math does not care who performs it, nor does it care who desperately wishes it to be different. It always arrives at the same objective destination. Finally, backstage at the studio, Ben Shapiro sat quietly with a bottle of water. He wasn't celebrating, rather he was contemplating the half-second of silence that followed his question about the cost. Over 15 years of debating, he had trained himself to listen for these specific silences, much like a mechanic expertly diagnosing an engine knock. That particular silence was the sound of a person who realizes they do not have the numbers and is frantically deciding whether to invent a fiction or admit to a blank. When the silence arrived, it sounded exactly like nothing, which is precisely what the Green New Deal fundamentally costs, according to the very woman who wrote it. Absolutely nothing. Zero, a framework that you simply don't price. Taking a sip of water, he briefly thought about the hypothetical math teacher he had invoked to humanize his argument, entirely unaware that she was a real woman in the Bronx who had successfully calculated the $455 billion figure 6 full seconds before he did. He would never know about Dorothy. And ultimately, it didn't matter. The math doesn't need to know who is doing it. The math just demands to be done. Last night, we saw 3 questions yield 3 profound blanks, exposing a massive proposal, utterly devoid of mathematical reality, leaving us with a lesson that every citizen should remember: never trust a policy when the numbers are left blank.